please let me know. For instance, yeah, yeah, thanks, that's more efficient. And so, our last talk to close this open symposium is Jonnathan Chase's talk, and John is a professor at iDiv and Martin Luther University in Germany, and I realized we only had presenters based in Germany actually this afternoon. But John, all yours. Do you want to sit or do you want to? Yeah.
Thank you. You know, being the last one to go, everybody's already stolen much of what I was going to talk about, so that's great. We can go to the coffee break now, which is good because I really don't want to focus too much on details of data or of the analyses. I want to talk more about a story of science and how we do it, and how I spent the last 25 years of my career being wrong most of the time, and how I think that is great, and I love it. And I know I'm going to be wrong a million times in this workshop. This is one of the most unique workshops I've ever been in because I don't study deep time. I tend to study much more recent things, and so I'm really just using the art as an insecurity to say most of what I have are data that are collected in much more recent times. This is a mural from Diego Rivera, a Mexican artist, and I grew up in Detroit, and this is one of my favorite murals on the Detroit auto industry from the 20s. So most of the data I'm talking about really are from the 1920s and later, 100 years, maybe if we're lucky, 120 years, not the kinds of crazy stuff that you guys have. Much of our data are much more recent, 60s and 70s, and even, you know, this is now classical data from the 90s when I was a graduate student. We're starting to resurvey these data sets and saying long-term data. Yeah, it was a long time ago. Even when I started as an assistant professor in the early 2000s, these Banksy was becoming quite popular. These are now 20-year-old data sets, and these are the kinds of data that I'm going to talk about today. But again, with the backdrop being not about so much the science, but about the scientists, and what we do and how we do it, and how we respond to the world around us. And I'm really taken by this quote. I don't want to get into the details of some of the philosophy from Levins and Lewontin, and they had some issues with communism and other things. Not going to talk about that. I want to talk about the fact that we're all biased. Yes, we have data that are biased, no question. There's biases in our analyses and all of that, but we're human beings and we're imperfect. We all have ideas. We collect those data because of those biases, where we go, how we collect them, how we set up our samplings and other things. And it's a society that influences these biases. And so we've talked, everybody has been talking about biases and baselines, so I'm just going to repeat that this is critical. And so as we start thinking about really using these data, harvesting these data from these crazy sources that you guys have, and trying to make sense of them, we need to really be careful and really think about counterfactuals and all the different kinds of things that we need to worry about. And again, this is sort of formed from the last 25 years of my career. I've been lucky enough to be involved in groups. Nothing as diverse as this one. This is the most diverse group that I've ever been involved in. And you can also see the receding hairline showing over these 25 years of these different synthesis groups that I've been involved in, where you bring people from around the world with different kinds of data, different kinds of skills, different kinds of tools, get them together and solve a problem. Whatever that problem might be in biodiversity or coexistence or whatever. And so been involved in a number of these groups, and then in Germany I've been very lucky to be involved in a bunch because this is part of my role at the iDiv Center. We have this sort of synthesis center which brings people together. Duarte was a postdoc as part of this center. And we try to solve problems. And in solving those problems, we have to deal with all this mess. And so I'm just going to give some examples. Victor already talked about this one. This example comes from resurveys from naturalists in Germany, showing this more than 75% decline. These were sort of the weekend hobby was to go out and collect bugs, and boom, this massive decline. we knew about this going on before this, but somehow this paper really, especially in Europe, in Germany, man, they went nuts. Really set people off, this insect apocalypse. And so at the time, right when this paper came out, a Dutch scientist, Roel van Klink, was at iDiv, had one of these postdocs that allowed him to have the flexibility to say, hey, I want to know how general this thing is. It's a cool problem. It's important, clearly, but are insects really crashing in this way? And so he started building a database, spent 2 years just building a database. And luckily, he was able to publish a very nice study based on this database. You can see these are the studies, and including the one Victor talked about, but many others. Clearly, it has all the biases that all of these global analyses, we get in trouble. We can't use the word global. We shouldn't use the word global, even though we often do. Clearly, major holes. But there were some interesting results from these kinds of data. Yeah, there was some declines, at least in terrestrial species. Aquatic species seem to be increasing. And this made some people angry. Fine, absolutely fine. It was based on the best available data, but it's not correct. We don't know if aquatic insects are increasing all over the world. We know that they're increasing in these data sets, and it seems to be really driven by a few places, especially in the western US. So, great, we have some answers. There seems to be, I wouldn't say apocalypse, but there's some serious, I was surprised by this result. I was convinced that this German study was just an anomaly. But with the best available evidence, at least in terrestrial systems, there were these declines. Not so much in aquatic systems, we don't quite know why. But this insect apocalypse is an indicator of what is biodiversity. We've spent the whole week talking about biodiversity. Not a single person has defined it. I can't define it because it's not a thing. It's this big amorphous concept that E.O. Wilson and colleagues gave to us in the 80s, but of course it was based on concepts much more distant than that. But it's a bunch of stuff, right? And so when we say insect apocalypse, that was based on abundance, just the amount of bug there is, right? But then other people are like, no, it's diversity, or it's evenness, or it's all these other things, and they started shoving them all together and saying, this is the insect apocalypse. All of this stuff is going on. Stuff is crashing. You're talking about wolves, that's one species. You're talking about 10 species. You're talking about some pike. You know, there's just a lot of different stuff going on that we all clump into this thing called biodiversity. Do they correlate? In English, we use the word apples and oranges in American English. I don't know what in Germany, they use apples and pears. I don't know what apples and pears in Spanish. I'm sorry, I'm going to use apples and oranges. Just, it's the best, it's what I can do. But of course, we have pears, we have pineapples. We're comparing things that aren't the same. They're very different. And when we're trying to quantify things, when we have metrics that we want to quantify, we got to really think about this stuff. Do they correlate? Not so much. Victor's studies showed declines in abundance, but increases in richness. Totally cool. We find the same thing in our insects. These are just a conglomerate of a bunch of different kinds of data. Change in abundance through time, change in richness through time. They correlate. They have to correlate. There's a mathematical link between the two. This is why we do rarefaction that was talked about earlier, because of this mathematical link. But man, that's a mess. There's lots of places where you get increases in abundance, decreases in richness, vice versa, all the kinds of things all over the board. Biodiversity is a mess. It's a complicated topic. This is at, just one scale. We haven't talked about scale at all. And this is what I've been obsessed with for 25 years, is this issue of scale and how that affects biodiversity in time and space. I believe this figure has been shown a dozen times already. I was very pleased to see it, as I had it in my talk too. Yeah, we talk about this global biodiversity crisis. It's a serious problem. Now, don't get me wrong, and the question that's going to be asked about policy, oh my God. It's been asked, I can't answer it. A lot of the nuance that I'm going to talk about, a lot of the details I'm going to talk about are horrible, and they create a mess when we go to the public. We don't have a good problem. But as scientists, we really need to think about our metrics and how we quantify them. And that's what I want to talk to you today about. So we have this global extinction rate, and we also often see these negative effects, these meta-analyses, these negative effects of various factors. We do experiments. I spent most of my career doing these kinds of experiments, dumping fertilizer in a pond, as we just saw with Dagmar, or adding cattle to an old field, or whatever the land use change is, it's bad. Okay? We see this a lot. And we can project this to the planet. These are data that were sort of played very prominently in the IPBS report. These come from the Predicts database that Andy Purvis and Tim Newbold and colleagues have put together. Hundreds of studies from across the world where they're measuring things like dumping fertilizer on the ground and seeing what it does, or changing land use, or adding cattle. Man, excuse me. That's a lot of red. 60% biodiversity loss. I have no idea what 60% means, but it's scary looking, right? This is what I really want to talk about, is how do we deal with that number? This is really useful. That map is beautiful for policymakers, but scientifically, we really need to think about it. And this really got ugly. 2013, about 10 years ago, Mark Velland and colleagues published a paper saying, local biodiversity is not changing, guys. I can go back, all of these spots, they went back, they did resurveys, 20, 30, 40, 100 years later, counted stuff, 10, 15, 20 species, not different. Some are increasing, some are decreasing, but on average, no net loss. And this word makes people angry. I'll tell you in a minute. Leticia remembers. Maria Dornales and colleagues did another analysis. This figure is shown millions of times at every one of these kinds of conferences. Some increasing diversity, lots decreasing, no net change. People get angry. No net change in biodiversity? How do we have this biodiversity crisis when it's not going down? And so people got really angry. And here you can see Leticia here. This was in 2014, 2015. The most amazing part of my career. This meeting, we put it together, it was put together by people who wanted to refute those analyses. They were angry at those analyses. iDiv was built 40 million euros from the German government to solve this problem that these guys are saying isn't a problem. So we put this thing together, but it was way too early, and I got involved and I made some terrible mistakes. One of the mistakes I made was I said, no, we can't just invite one group of people who believe this is wrong. We got to bring both groups of people together. So here's Maria Dornales, and Mark Velland is here, and all the people on both sides, but it was too raw. It was ugly. I've never seen anything like this. I literally, at one point, had to grab Andy Gonzalez as he leapt out of his chair and pull him back down as he was running to yell at somebody else. It was really, at dinner, it was uncomfortable. It was awful. I have never seen this before in my career, and so I find it quite entertaining. Now, that slide didn't pop through. 2 years later, we tried again. People had calmed down. People had gotten that out of their system. They published their comments, and they published their aggressive replies, and we actually made some progress. And we published a paper, and a very nice paper. It didn't say anything super profound, but it was really fabulous to get this published. And again, the thing I'm most proud of in this paper is the author list. And again, I'm not trying to brag, I'm only fifth author in this, but the thing I'm most proud about this paper is getting people, like I had separate DMs where I had to get on the phone with people and say, please do not drop off of this paper, as they were threatening to drop off of the paper. I mean, literally, people are like, I'm out of here. I'm just done. And we got them all on. And that was fabulous. And then it kind of fell apart again as they started publishing more fancy, glossy papers in Science and Nature. Some of the crowd got angry and said, oh, we're going to write the responses. And some of the same co-authors who are co-authors together are now writing responses and sending tweets at each other and saying, I don't believe your data, it's lousy data. So, why? Why do we have these problems? We're not talking about the same thing. We're talking about apples and pears and oranges and pineapples. Here's one simple example. Again, the Predicts database. People are collecting data, looking at changes in biodiversity through space. As we saw a really beautiful talk yesterday, saying space for time isn't always the same as time for time. This is space for time. But this is also an analysis, so, what I really like, so look at, where we are in Germany, where I live in the eastern Germany is bright red. Here's Halle, the city of Halle, where my professorship is, and they had beautiful data going back hundreds of years from the Halle Botanical Garden on how many species lived in Halle. There are more species today in Halle than there were 400 or 500 years ago, just like in these lake sediments. They're different. There's some invasive species, of course, but counting biodiversity, the numbers of species, no values, just numbers, more species today. So how do you get bright red 60% loss? Is because we're not measuring the same thing. These Predicts data are based on meter squared quadrats, usually, or some small pitfall traps, or all these other things, various kinds of data that all come from the kinds of stuff that we do, when we're counting stuff in the sediment traps or whatever. And so we have these problem where we're talking about biodiversity, but we're not talking about the same thing. Different metrics, but even when we have the same metric, species richness, we have scale hitting us in the face. And so we're fighting, but we need to find a solution, and part of the solution is to think about how to deal with scale, okay? I'm not the first person to think about this. Everybody's been thinking about this. Cardinale and Andy Gonzalez and others in one of their first big aggressive fights against this stuff wrote a whole paper about how lousy these other analyses were and said, we got to start thinking about scale. We need to quantify biotic homogenization. Notice the bias. They know it's going in one direction. It must be going in that direction because global biodiversity is increasing. Even if these guys are right, and they're not right, even if they were right and local diversity isn't doing much, it's got to be because of biotic homogenization. Jens Svenning talked about biotic homogenization yesterday as a fact. Okay. Erickson and Hillebrand, in their sort of news and views on our science paper, said, okay, they're not finding net change in local richness. It must be because something's going on at the regional scale. They put this figure in their little science note about our paper. We had nothing to do with this data. We did not look at regional diversity. We only looked at local diversity. They made this. I mean, I love Helmut and these guys. Absolutely love them. They're brilliant. But they had a bias in their heads that this has to be what's going on. It's the only way we could see that result. Yeah? We are screwing up the world. Don't get me wrong. We are absolutely screwing up the world. But if we're scientists and we're quantifying metrics and we're trying to bend curves, what are we bending? What are we measuring? What are we comparing? So yeah, I grew up in suburbs of the United States and we have all these problems. We're absolutely homogenizing the world. You can go to Dubai and the Middle East and find Starbucks. You can go to China and find McDonald's and KFC. We have the same thing with species. You can see these dudes all over the world, right? Homogenization. It is, in our view, our perspective, where we're walking around, there's a lot of stuff that's the same, and it didn't used to be so much the same before. Homogenization. So, yeah, scale is important, but it actually turns out this is a little bit complicated. I don't want to get into too much of the details. These are results from all of these drivers, disturbance, land use, blah, blah, blah. But where I could get a hold of data where they measured biodiversity at 2 scales. And this is just the meta-analysis, the effect size. So this study had a little bit of an effect size at the small scale and a really big effect size at the big scale, right? And vice versa. And so we can find out where each one of these goes. There's a 1-to-1 line. But then there's the sort of average. Of course, there's a ton of variation, so don't take this too seriously. But on average, the effect sizes at bigger scales are smaller than the effect sizes at larger scales. And the implication is really important because it means that all of these meter squared little pitfall traps and other things that are being measured in the predicts data set. Great data. I collect those data all the time. Use them all the time. But then they project them onto these pixels at very large scales and say 60% loss, right? But what this is saying is that if there's 60% loss at a small scale, that does not mean there's 60% loss at a bigger scale. There's less, right? Because I see more and more species as I grain scales, there's scale dependence. And it's going in the opposite direction that we usually think in this case. Bigger scales have less of an effect than smaller scales. Scale dependence, it's just math. It's inevitable. If I compare 2 time points or 2 spatial points or whatever these 2 things are, I get curves of biodiversity with sampling effort. Those curves cannot be parallel. Mathematically impossible. That's scale dependence. And so they can either converge. That means beta diversity is going down. They can diverge and beta diversity is going up. They can do all sorts of stuff. But when we measure and compare data that combine all of these different kinds of things, we're really creating a lot of fruit salad. So are we headed towards this homogene that people are often talking about? Are we creating everything the same? Yeah, there's pigeons everywhere, spotted knapweed everywhere, carp everywhere. But how do we measure this? So, Whitaker gave us this nice equation, very easy equation. Gamma diversity is equal to alpha diversity times beta diversity. Beta diversity, I've spent 25 years of my career fighting with, and it always wins because it's a horrible, horrible metric. Even using Whitaker's equation, it's horrible. There are so many different ways to get beta diversity changing. I'm not going to get into the details. There's a ton of going on here. Again, overview. The point is homogenization below the line if there's a change in gamma diversity or a change in alpha diversity. This is where beta diversity is lower. This is where beta diversity is higher. And there's many different ways to get there. That's all that's saying. There's lots of ways that we can get changes in occupancy to shove me above or below that line. So even with this elegant metric, there's a lot going on underneath it, and it's really messy. And so this is where the resurveys come in, and I think why maybe I was invited to present here, even though I really am not using these very long-term data. But I'm very interested in getting the best we can, especially trying to deal with things like scale and sampling effort and all these other things to see how things are changing. And of course, we've already heard about the Walden Woods data set. I was just amazed, Dorte can remember as well at iDiv, 10, 15 years ago, people were starting to sort of revisit some of these classic sites, and it was phenomenal. It was so cool. Joseph Grinnell, the inventor of the word niche for ecology, invented the word niche. In the early 1900s, was director of the museum at the University of California and said, let's go out and count stuff, birds and mammals. And one of the main reasons was so that 100 years later, they could count stuff again. He specifically said that. And Steve Beisinger and colleagues at the University of California did just that. They went back and they started counting stuff in the same places and found some really interesting and important results of change. Robert Whitaker, inventor of alpha, beta, gamma diversity, walked up and down mountains counting stuff, right? And kept his data in such a way that Ellen Damshin and Susan Harrison could go back and flip through his notes, find out where he went and find out how many plants he counted, and go back to those same sites and calculate alpha, beta, and gamma diversity. Totally cool. Today, this is now a thing. Everybody's doing this. From the 90s, from even the early 2000s, from the 70s, the 80s, wherever we can get a hold of a data set where somebody was smart enough to have kept their data notebooks around or geolocated where their sites were or whatever. So they're coming and coming. We have been able to get together more than 200 of these data sets. Some of these come from things like biotime, where they're more continuously measured, but a whole bunch of them come from these sites where we just went back, just like the talk yesterday, to sites that were sampled in the 70s, the 30s, the 50s, whenever, and just started seeing what happened, what changed. And so this is just sort of a bit of the data, and I want to just point out the shotgun. Are we heading towards the homogene? Are we homogenizing the world? Sort of. We get a lot of these gains in high occupancy species, these are the pigeons and the carps and the knotweeds and the things, right? Yeah, a lot of sites are doing that, but a whole lot of sites are differentiating. We see a signal for homogenization, but it's pretty weak. And we see a lot of variation that show up in these different parts of the graph. Oops. And so we can dissect this a little bit further. Usually when we think about homogenization, we're thinking about checklists, like islands before European colonization or after, or Europe before 1500 and after. And we can calculate these numbers because we know how many species are invasive or exotic, and we know how many species went extinct, and we can calculate these numbers. And when you look at these larger scale, longer time things, yeah, we see a lot more below the line. And this is like, for example, a field site that I spent a lot of time in Hawaii. You see this. Hawaii had this beautiful adaptive radiation. Every island has its own species. Lots of adaptive radiations on each island. Today, all the same birds, right? And so locally, alpha diversity on Hawaii is huge. Every island has a whole lot more bird species now than it did in the past. But regionally, globally, all those endemic species have gone extinct. We're getting homogenization. Great. What about the breeding bird survey of North America? We have 50 years of data now. Let's look at that. Oh no, it's not homogenizing in North America. It's differentiating. As we increase in scale, we're seeing more species richness at larger scales. It's going up, right? So this whole, let's study homogenization isn't working over the last 50 years. And so I've been staring at these things for years, or for months, so I'm going to make you stare at them. We're changing the landscape, no question, but are we homogenizing it? We're creating actually more heterogeneity. Think about it. We think it's homogenizing, but we're creating heterogeneity in a lot of these systems. I grew up in the US, and you watch things through time. I'm not giving you the numbers here, and we're working on these, but we're making the world more heterogeneous in many places. Poland, we've heard talk about, it's becoming more heterogeneous. You're in Spain, it's becoming more heterogeneous. Where I live in Germany, look at what's going on in the East German times, and then all of a sudden you get all these wetlands and these beautiful lakes, and people are living on them, and this is one of the best birding hotspots in Germany. Those wetlands weren't even there. Think about the beta diversity going on in that system. Of course, we know it can go the other way eventually, right? These, again, I don't have the numbers here, but it looks to me like these are becoming super homogeneous by the end, right? And so there's probably a hump-shaped relationship, and you can probably do some math to show exactly what that would look like. But a lot of the time, we're creating heterogeneity, not homogenization. And so we think the world is homogenizing. We've heard it here. We say it all the time. Part of the problem is that beta diversity is a horrible beast. It's a terrible metric, and every way we calculate it is different. The math is different. It comes out differently, and there's many ways that lead to it. Part of the problem is that we have biases and baselines of what we think is homogenization. Where we live, everything might be the same, but we're actually creating heterogeneity. Spatial scale, temporal scale, and organizational scale. A lot of what we've talked about, when people think about homogenization, they're talking about a few species, right? And so we can look at the same data set in a different way. We just published this data set last week, and everybody said, oh, that's homogenization. But it wasn't measured in the way we often measure beta diversity. What we found here is that, for example, the narrow range species, we use GBIF to measure range size, and we found that narrow range species on average are declining or not doing so well in their metacommunities, whereas broad range species are increasing. Sounds like homogenization, right? But the same data set didn't show that because it's a different metric. So absolutely, narrow range species are suffering, broad range species are doing better. That's bad if we have some judgments on that. But it's not leading to beta diversity decline. the way we think it does, because the math doesn't work out. It's a species level problem, not a community level problem. And so these are, we show it, again, across all of these data sets. These cabbage palms in Australia are sort of narrow range species going down, whereas this shrub is increasing. And we can even show that habitat protection changes this effect. Again, there's a lot going on underneath these models that I don't want to get into, but one data set from Portugal showed that this sort of nature reserve had a more narrow range species, this little bustard, doing better or less worse, whereas nearby farms, the sort of common species were growing. This is what we think of as homogenization. But it's not showing up in many of the metrics that we measure. And so, again, I don't have an answer for the policymakers, but when we talk about bending the curve, we really need to remember what that y-axis is. And we need to really think about how we're going to measure it and quantify it, because it's nuanced. And I know we don't want to present that to the world, but I don't know how to deal with it. And so we need to really remember that biodiversity is changing, no question, but how do we quantify it? We need better methods, better analytical tools, and just recognizing that we're wrong most of the time. And we have to remember that when we deal with our biases. So thanks.
Thank you, John. We have time for questions and comments.
We also have coffee.
There's also coffee, yeah. Nestor?
Thank you, John. Well, amazing talk, as always. So the question, I see here like many different dimensions together in multiple dimensions at the same time. I mean, when you're speaking about different definitions of biodiversity and metrics and so on, in reality there are two different things mixed up here. One is how you measure, with which measures you measure one specific aspect of biodiversity, and this is all discussion about gamma, alpha, beta diversity, and so on. And the second is how conceptually we define the multiple dimensions of biodiversity, right? So in reality, the complex is even more complex than the problem is even more complex than we are discussing here. So have you or are you aware of any kind of attempt to identify to what extent those two things intersect, the multiple dimensions intrinsic to definitions of biodiversity versus the multiple metrics to measure each of those other dimensions?
I'm trying to...
so how would you disentangle the difference between what you try to measure using different metrics, for example, in community metrics, versus different dimensions of biodiversity, which makes reference to many other things, like, for example, ecosystem functions, species distributions, etc.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm not even going to touch things like other dimensions. Like, when I talk about other dimensions, I'm usually thinking about things that we can quantify relatively in the same realm, like functional diversity or phylogenetic diversity. When you start talking about ecosystem functions or services, the math, the connections are really, I think we want them to be much cleaner than they are. And so I haven't made those connections. Some people are thinking about making the connections to ecosystem functions, because usually those are pretty straightforward. We can create a linear relationship. I don't usually believe those, but at least they think they can, and they can put that linear relationship into the math and say, okay, if we change biodiversity by a certain amount, we're going to change function by a certain amount, and they're linked, right? And so you can, and many of the metrics that I'm talking about are absolutely linked, right? Because we've got this, multidimensional elephant thing that we're all trying to figure out what it looks like, but they're all part of the same problem, right? And so many of biodiversity metrics are connected. Connecting them to other dimensions like services or functions, something I personally have a lot of doubts, because I don't believe those are linked in the ways that I think we want them to be, as simple as they are. So, sorry, I'm not going to give you a good answer.
I have a question actually on the resurvey that you showed. So with all this large-scale data sets, I'm always wondering about what might have changed on those sites.
Yeah.
between the two times. Do you have an idea of how many sites were altered by human activities, for instance, and which type of activity?
Yeah, I mean, that's the subject of my next grant proposal. And so drivers is something I've been scared of. Drivers are, of course, the thing we need to do. I'm just in patterns. I'm just describing stuff. Drivers are the key. And so that's one of the reasons why I was staring at these little GIFs that were made from Google Earth, because that's land use. And we're looking at the deltas of land use. And then we can compare that to the deltas of species diversity or beta diversity and correlate the two. And we're absolutely working on that. It's not as easy. The geospatial data are not as clean as my colleagues like to think they are when you actually go and ground truth them. And but absolutely working on that. The drivers are critical to this whole problem. And so if we could say the ones that are homogenizing are the ones where the land use is over the hump, that'd be fabulous. Let you know in a couple years.
Thank you. There are more questions. I see two. I saw you first.
Thank you. You highlighted the need to recognize and accept biases. Is it a call for ecologists to collaborate with social sciences to, sorry, to explore the question? And
I will simply say I'm too naive to know how that could help. But I absolutely see your point. And again, this all just comes from 25 years of being wrong. And I just think we need to embrace that. But I think there probably are methods that our colleagues in other fields could give us to sort of say why we're wrong. This is just brute force running into a wall a million times until I say, oh, there's a door over there, right? And so you're absolutely right that I think there are probably tools and mechanisms that people can help us get through this. I'm too stupid to know exactly what they could help us with, but I would love to hear that. Yeah, and this is what I also learn all the time, is that we're all running into the same walls. We're just using different words, and we're using different jargon and other things. And so absolutely, I think there are sort of scientific philosophies that and social sciences and ways to deal with it that could help.
Peter, did you want to specifically address this point? Or no? Okay, so I'll pass first to...
Thanks, Jonathan. It was very reviving, your talk at the end of the at the end of the day. I appreciate it very much. And it struck a chord because I struggle with these thoughts a lot myself in my work. And sometimes I tell myself that, the simple and plain solution to this is to be clear in terms about what we're using. Are we measuring abundance? Are we measuring richness? And that seems like just a pure element of scientific hygiene to me. Yeah. And publication hygiene. And I couldn't help not noticing that many of the papers that you brought up as examples are papers published in very prominent journals like Science and Nature, which brings me, I'm sort of speaking my mind, so apologize my incoherence, but it brings me to the idea is that in these journals where the scientific hygiene or publication hygiene is actually not that high standard, because we're just using buzzwords as biodiversity when we could be very clear about what we're actually measuring and be very clear about our messages.
Yeah,
I'm just curious on...
I'm not sure I have a good answer, but in your talk yesterday, I definitely noticed that we have a kindred spirit in many ways. And so I'm thinking about, we have to be absolutely clear in thinking about how to present our metrics. What are we talking about? I think they do, but a lot of it's usually buried in these supplements, right? In these shiny papers. And so I do think part of it is just being clear and honest. Part of it certainly might be that we're doing a sell job to sell it to these kinds of journals. We're not going to get people to stop trying to publish in these kinds of journals. But when I review papers, I call people out, and hopefully the rest of us can also be more clear about what we're measuring and what we're analyzing. As soon as you do that, you create the risk of the editor saying, oh, this isn't so spicy, this isn't so great, why do we want it in our fancy journal? It's a trade-off.
Thank you. I rephrase my question. How do we solve the problem?
It sounds like a beer conversation, but again, I just think we all need to work towards, for me, language, precision is critical. And again, no offense to my colleagues who are more interested in policy, because I wish I could do that better, but I really think we lose that link when we want to communicate to policymakers. The question that you asked earlier to Victor is brilliant, and his answer was brilliant. It's hard. I'm talking to my press people all the time, and they want to give clear messages, and I fight with them all the time, because nuance is hard. I don't have a good answer, I'm sorry. I wish I did. Except precision, I prefer. Yeah, you're in charge.
Then I have Adam.
I have a philosophical question. You talked about, what was happening 100 years ago, and you see, my gloomier ecological friends, they always say, in 100 years, the only thing interesting from what we're doing is going to be the data. So I was wondering, I don't know if that's true, but I was just wondering, what do you think people will be doing in 100 years with the data that you have now? And what is, I know it's a, yeah, but what is it that you could sort of do to help them in, those people in 100 years? Sorry.
You guys are not nice. First of all, I will answer, the first part is, I agree. I wish I was better archiving my data from when I started my career, and all the fancy analyses that we do, all the R packages that we build, they're going to be gone. They're going to be archaic. And so it's the data that are going to be the most valuable, no question. And so I guess, the monitoring, there's no science and nature papers in data collection, right? This is the problem, or taxonomy, or all the other things that we lament that we're losing. But those are the things that are going to matter in 100 years. Our fancy R packages, probably not so much. No offense, beautiful Bayesian models, but, so, God, sorry, I'm just going to blab. I don't have good advice. To the 100-year from now person.
So next we have Adam. You still have a question? Yeah. No? Sure.
I would try to reformulate your question a little bit. Is it not that, the context is that I spent most of my career in climate change research, climate history and similar stuff, not being climate historian myself that much, but like the pressure of the public debate is so huge that it's really kind of blocking, maybe not honesty of many people, yes, but it works in the subconscious, I would say, yes, in the way they see and they want to present their stuff, they want to be relevant. So to what extent also part of the problem here is that we have the biodiversity crisis idea has been formulated, it made it to the public, it became the justification, like it both mobilized the public to demand a policy, it became justification for the policy, and somehow, like the problem is how to reformulate, how to advance science without using this mobilization power. So to not end up in a situation, that many latent TIC authors would describe, okay, there is philosophy for the people, but here in our room among us Neoplatonists, we know the real philosophy and we discuss about the real stuff, yes? And we only sell these things we don't think are true, proper to those who cannot get it. But you see the risk?
Absolutely. I don't know how I feel. There's this guy, he has this website on climate science called The Honest Broker, and his name is Roger Pilkey Jr., and I think he's quite a controversial figure. He thinks he's the honest broker, and he's just sort of pointing out that actually hurricanes aren't more intense and blah, 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 blah. You guys are really overselling it. I don't know, because I don't know enough about climate science. He came to iDiv and sort of gave a reasonably compelling talk about, you know, are we honest brokers, or do we need to hide the dirty laundry? You know, that's sort of the nuance that, you know, this is what some of the individuals in that early debate exactly 100% said. You guys are destroying it. All this money and all these other things that we're getting, you're destroying it because, you know, the people are grabbing this information and saying there's no problem, just like there's no climate change. Again, I'm sorry, I'm a wimp. I am absolutely a wimp. Nestor and other folks are really out there trying to deal with it, and I'm hiding in my ivory tower. Sorry, I wish I could do better.
Thanks. Is there any other? Yes. I didn't want to end on this negativity.
It's always going to be.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm just curious, Catalina and I were talking earlier about how science in certain quarters has taken a hit in terms of its credibility, maybe particularly over the pandemic, maybe particularly in the context of climate change. I'm thinking mostly about the American political context. And so I'm just curious if we can be more honest brokers, if we can be more nuanced, precise, more conservative in our claims, et cetera, do you see a real potential for restoring some of that lost political credibility for science?
Letitia, it's going to get worse. You don't want to end on a bad note. How can I talk about the American political system without it just going in the crap? Do you have an answer for this? Because you can bail me out. I know. I have for the last couple of hours. I'm 100% with you. Yeah, and I apologize for copting out of answering. Again, coffee or probably better alcohol is the conversation there. But I do agree that here, I need help. I think we all need help. And how to present to the public some of these problems. You know, I follow friends of mine even involved in the COVID stuff because they're just ecologists who got stuck. Peter Daszak, head of the Eco Alliance, is being accused of, this Wuhan lab stuff because he had a grant, and Trump revoked his grant. He's just an ecologist studying bats and their diseases, and all of a sudden he got thrown to the wolves for this situation, and he's handled it well. I would be a quivering mess. I don't know what he's like at home, but I mean, watching him publicly, I don't know, and we're not dealing with anything like, what they had to go through.
Thanks again. So I think I'll take Katarina's call for coffee. But I wanted to thank you again and thank all of you because this has been some amazing symposium as far as I'm concerned. So thank you.
Thank you all. We are extremely happy that you all came. We feel very lucky. It has been so nice. And we will have now a quick coffee because no later than 5:15, we should be going out the door to the Archivo de Indias. So thank you also for the people that have come to listen to the talks and to you all.
And if you're not going to the dinner tonight, just tell me. I already know for some of you. Where do you want to?